Chapter 12, Part 1, of the Influence of Sea Power upon History, 1660 to 1783, by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12, Events in the East Indies, 1778 to 1781. Suffren sails from Brest, 1781. His brilliant naval campaign in the Indian Seas, 1782–1783. The very interesting and instructive campaign of Suffren in the East Indies, although in itself by far the most noteworthy and meritorious naval performance of the War of 1778, failed, through no fault of his, to affect the general issue. It was not till 1781 that the French court felt able to direct upon the East naval forces adequate to the importance of the issue. Yet the conditions of the peninsula at that time were such as to give an unusual opportunity for shaking the English power. Hyder Ali, the most skilful and daring of all the enemies against whom the English had yet fought in India, was then ruling over the kingdom of Mysore, which, from its position in the southern part of the peninsula, threatened both the Carnatic and Malabar coast. Hyder, then 10 years before, had maintained alone a most successful war against the intruding foreigners, concluding with a peace upon the terms of a mutual restoration of conquests, and he was now angered by the capture of Mahé. On the other hand, a number of warlike tribes, known by the name of the Mahrattas, of the same race and loosely knit together in a kind of feudal system, had become involved in war with the English. The territory occupied by these tribes, whose chief capital was at Poonah, near Bombay, extended northward from Mysore to the Ganges. With boundaries thus conterminous and placed centrally with reference to the three English presidencies of Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras, Hyder and the Mahrattas were in a position of advantage for mutual support and for offensive operations against the common enemy. At the beginning of the war between England and France, a French agent appeared at Poonah. It was reported to Warren Hastings, the Governor-General, that the tribes had agreed to terms and ceded to the French a seaport on the Malabar coast. With his usual promptness, Hastings at once determined on war, and sent a division of the Bengal army across the Jumna and into Berar. Another body of 4,000 English troops also marched from Bombay, but being badly led, was surrounded and forced to surrender in January 1779. This unusual reverse quickened the hopes and increased the strength of the enemies of the English, and although the material injury was soon remedied by substantial successes under able leaders, the loss of prestige remained. The anger of Hyder Ali, roused by the capture of Mahé, was increased by imprudent thwarting on the part of the governor of Madras. Seeing the English entangled with the Mahrattas, and hearing that a French armament was expected on the Coromandel coast, he quietly prepared for war. In the summer of 1780, swarms of his horsemen descended without warning from the hills and appeared near the gates of Madras. In September, one body of English troops, 3,000 strong, was cut to pieces, and another of 5,000 was only saved by a rapid retreat upon Madras, losing its artillery and trains. Unable to attack Madras, Hyder turned upon the scattered posts separated from each other and the capital by the open country, which was now wholly in his control. Such was the state of affairs when, in January 1781, a French squadron of 6 ships of the line and 3 frigates appeared on the coast. The English fleet under Sir Edward Hughes had gone to Bombay. To the French commodore, Count d'Orves, Hyder appealed for aid in an attack upon Cuddalore. Deprived of support by sea and surrounded by the myriads of natives, the place must have fallen. D'Orves, however, refused and returned to the Isle of France. At the same time, one of the most skilful of the English Indian soldiers, Sir Héricourt took the field against Hyder. The latter at once raised the siege of the beleaguered posts, and after a series of operations extending through the spring months, was brought to battle on the 1st of July, 1781. His total defeat restored to the English the open country, saved the Carnatic, and put an end to the hopes of the partisans of the French in their late possession of Pondicherry. A great opportunity had been lost. Meanwhile, a French officer of very different temper from his predecessors was on his way to the East Indies. It will be remembered that when De Grasse sailed from Brest, March 22, 1781, for the West Indies, there went with his fleet a division of 5 ships of the line under Suffren. The latter separated from the main body on the 29th of the month, taking with him a few transports destined for the Cape of Good Hope, then a Dutch colony. The French government had learned that an expedition from England was destined to seize this important halting place on the road to India, and Suffren's first mission was to secure it. In fact, the squadron under Commodore Johnston had got away first and had anchored at Porto Praya in the Cape Verde Islands, a Portuguese colony, on the 11th of April. It numbered 2 ships of the line and 3 of 50 guns, with frigates and smaller vessels, besides 35 transports, mostly armed. Without apprehension of attack, not because he trusted to the neutrality of the port, but because he thought his destination secret, the English commodore had not anchored with a view to battle. It so happened that at the moment of sailing from Brest, one of the ships intended for the West Indies was transferred to Suffren's squadron. She consequently had not water enough for the longer voyage, and this with other reasons determined Suffren also to anchor at Porto Praya. On the 16th of April, 5 days after Johnston, he made the island early in the morning, and stood for the anchorage, sending a coppered ship ahead to reconnoitre. Approaching from the eastward, the land for some time hid the English squadron, but at 9:15 the advance ship, the Artésien, signaled that enemy ships were anchored in the bay. The latter is open to the southward, and extends from east to west about 1.5 miles. The conditions are such that ships usually lie in the northeast part, near the shore. The English were there, stretching irregularly in a west-northwest line. Both Suffren and Johnston were surprised, but the latter more so, and the initiative remained with the French officer. Few men were fitter, by natural temper and the teaching of experience, for the prompt decision required. Of ardent disposition and inborn military genius, Suffren had learned, in the conduct of Boscawen toward the squadron of de la Clue, in which he had served, not to lay weight upon the power of Portugal to enforce respect for her neutrality. He knew that this must be the squadron meant for the Cape of Good Hope. The only question for him was, whether to press on to the Cape, with the chance of getting there first, or to attack the English at their anchors, in the hope of so crippling them as to prevent their further progress. He decided for the latter, and although the ships of his squadron, not sailing equally well, were scattered, he also determined to stand in at once, rather than lose the advantage of a surprise. Making signal to prepare for action at anchor, he took the lead in his flag-ship, the Hérault, of 74 guns, hauled close round the southeast point of the bay, and stood for the English flag-ship. He was closely followed by the Hannibal, 74. The advance ship Artésien, a 64, also stood on with him, but the 2 rear ships were still far astern. The English commodore got ready for battle as soon as he made out the enemy, but had no time to rectify his order. Suffren anchored 500 feet from the flag-ship's starboard beam. By a singular coincidence, the English flag-ship was also called Hérault, thus having enemy's ships on both sides, and opened fire. The Hannibal anchored ahead of her commodore, and so close that the latter had to veer cable and drop astern; but her captain, ignorant of Suffren's intention to disregard the neutrality of the port, had not obeyed the order to clear for action, and was wholly unprepared. His decks, lumbered with water casks, which had been got up to expedite watering, and the guns not cast loose. He did not add to this fault by any hesitation, but followed the flag-ship boldly, receiving passively the fire, to which for a time he was unable to reply. Luffing to the wind, he passed to windward of his chief, chose his position with skill, and atoned by his death for his first fault. These two ships were so placed as to use both broadsides. The Artesian, in the smoke, mistook an East India ship for a man of war. Running alongside, her captain was struck dead at the moment he was about to anchor, and the critical moment being lost by the absence of a head, the ship drifted out of close action, carrying the East Indiaman along with her. The remaining two vessels, coming up late, failed to keep close enough to the wind, and they too were thrown out of action. Then Suffren, finding himself with only two ships to bear the brunt of the fight, cut his cable and made sail. The Hannibal followed his movement, but so much injured was she that her fore and main masts went over the side, fortunately not till she was pointed out from the bay, which she left shorn to a hulk. Putting entirely aside questions of international law, the wisdom and conduct of Suffren's attack, from the military point of view, invite attention. To judge them properly, we must consider what was the object of the mission with which he was charged, and what were the chief factors in thwarting or forwarding it. His first object was to protect the Cape of Good Hope against an English expedition. The chief reliance for effecting his purpose was to get there first. The obstacle to his success was the English fleet. To anticipate the arrival of the latter, two courses were open to him: to run for it in the hope of winning the race, or to beat the enemy and so put him out of the running altogether. So long as his whereabouts was unknown, a search, unless with very probable information, would be a waste of time; but when fortune had thrown his enemy across his path, the genius of Suffren at once jumped to the conclusion that the control of the sea in southern waters would determine the question, and should be settled at once. To use his own strong expression, the destruction of the English squadron would cut off the root of all the plans and projects of that expedition, gain us for a long time the superiority in India, a superiority whence might result a glorious peace, and hinder the English from reaching the Cape before me, an object which has been fulfilled and was the principal aim of my mission. He was ill informed as to the English force, believing it greater than it was, but he had it at disadvantage and surprised. The prompt decision to fight, therefore, was right, and it is the most pronounced merit of Suffren in this affair that he postponed for the moment, dismissed, so to speak, from his mind, the ulterior projects of the cruise. But in so doing he departed from the traditions of the French navy and the usual policy of his government. It cannot be imputed to him as a fault that he did not receive from his captains the support he was fairly entitled to expect. The accidents and negligence which led to their failure have been mentioned, but having his three best ships in hand, there can be little doubt he was right in profiting by the surprise, and trusting that the two in reserve would come up in time. The position taken by his own ship and by the Hannibal, enabling them to use both broadsides, in other words, to develop their utmost force, was excellently judged. He thus availed himself to the full of the advantage given by the surprise and by the lack of order in the enemy's squadron. This lack of order, according to English accounts, threw out of action two of their 50-gun ships, a circumstance which, while discreditable to Johnston, confirmed Suffren's judgment in precipitating his attack. Had he received the aid upon which, after all deductions, he was justified in counting, he would have destroyed the English squadron. As it was, he saved the Cape Colony at Porto Praya. It is not surprising, therefore, that the French court, notwithstanding its traditional sea policy and the diplomatic embarrassment caused by the violation of Portuguese neutrality, should have heartily and generously acknowledged a vigor of action to which it was unused in its admirals. It has been said that Suffren, who had watched the cautious movements of D'Estaing in America and had served in the 7 Years' War, attributed in part the reverses suffered by the French at sea to the introduction of tactics, which he stigmatized as the veil of timidity. but that the results of the fight at Porto Praya, necessarily engaged without previous arrangement, convinced him that system and method had their use. Certainly his tactical combinations afterward were of a high order, especially in his earlier actions in the East, for he seems again to have abandoned them in the later fights under the disappointment caused by his captain's disaffection or blundering. But his great and transcendent merit lay in the clearness with which he recognized in the English fleets the exponent of the British sea power, the proper enemy of the French fleet, to be attacked first and always when with any show of equality. Far from blind to the importance of those ulterior objects to which the action of the French navy was so constantly subordinated, he yet saw plainly that the way to assure those objects was not by economizing his own ships, but by destroying those of the enemy. Attack, not defence, was the road to sea power in his eyes, and sea power meant control of the issues upon the land, at least in regions distant from Europe. This view out of the English policy he had the courage to take, after 40 years of service in a navy sacrificed to the opposite system; but he brought to its practical application a method not to be found in any English admiral of the day, except perhaps Rodney, and a fire superior to the latter. Yet the course thus followed was no mere inspiration of the moment; it was the result of clear views previously held and expressed. However informed by natural ardor, it had the tenacity of an intellectual conviction. Thus he wrote to D'Estaing, after the failure to destroy Barrington's squadron at Sta. Lucia, remonstrating upon the half-manned condition of his own and other ships, from which men had been landed to attack the English troops. Notwithstanding the small results of the 2 cannonades of the 15th of December, directed against Barrington's squadron, and the unhappy check our land forces have undergone, we may yet hope for success. But the only means to have it is to attack vigorously the squadron, which, with our superiority, cannot resist, notwithstanding its land batteries, whose effects will be neutralized if we run them aboard, or anchor upon their buoys. If we delay, they may escape. Besides, our fleet being unmanned, it is in condition neither to sail nor to fight. What would happen if Admiral Byron's fleet should arrive? What would become of ships having neither crews nor admiral? Their defeat would cause the loss of the army and the colony. Let us destroy that squadron. Their army, lacking everything and in a bad country, would soon be obliged to surrender. Then let Byron come; we shall be pleased to see him. I think it is not necessary to point out that for this attack we need men, and plans well concerted with those who are to execute them." Equally did he condemn the failure of D'Estaing to capture the 4 crippled ships of Byron's squadron after the action off Grenada. Owing to a combination of misfortunes, the attack at Porto Praya had not the decisive result it deserved. Commodore Johnston got under way and followed Suffren, but he thought his force was not adequate to attack in face of the resolute bearing of the French, and feared the loss of time consequent upon chasing to leeward of his port. He succeeded, however, in retaking the East India ship which the Artesian had carried out. Suffren continued his course and anchored at the Cape in Simon's Bay on the 21st of June. Johnston followed him a fortnight later, but learning by an advanced ship that the French troops had been landed, he gave up the enterprise against the colony, made a successful commerce-destroying attack upon 5 Dutch India ships in Saldanha Bay, which poorly repaid the failure of the military undertaking, and then went back himself to England, after sending the ships of the line on to join Sir Edward Hughes in the East Indies. Having seen the Cape secured, Suffren sailed for the Isle of France, arriving there on the 25th of October, 1781. Count d'Orves, being senior, took command of the united squadron. The necessary repairs were made, and the fleet sailed for India December 17. On the 22nd of January, 1782, an English 50-gun ship, the Hannibal, was taken. On the 9th of February, Count d'Orves died, and Suffren became commander-in-chief with the rank of commodore. A few days later the land was seen to the northward of Madras, but owing to head winds the city was not sighted until February 15. 9 large ships of war were found anchored in order under the guns of the forts. They were the fleet of Sir Edward Hughes, not in confusion like that of Johnston. Here, at the meeting point between these two redoubtable champions, each curiously representative of the characteristics of his own race, the one of the stubborn tenacity and seamanship of the English, the other of the ardor and tactical science of the French, too long checked and betrayed by a false system, is the place to give an accurate statement of the material forces. The French fleet had 3 74s, 7 64s, and 2 50-gun ships, one of which was the lately captured English Hannibal. To these Sir Edward Hughes opposed 2 74s, 1 70, 1 68, 4 64s, and 1 50-gun ship. The odds, therefore, 12-9, were decidedly against the English, and it is likely that the advantage in single-ship power, class for class, was also against them. It must be recalled that at the time of his arrival Suffren found no friendly port or roadstead, no base of supplies or repair. The French posts had all fallen by 1779, and his rapid movement, which saved the Cape, did not bring him up in time to prevent the capture of the Dutch Indian possessions. The invaluable harbor of Trincomalee in Ceylon was taken just 1 month before Suffren saw the English fleet at Madras. But if he thus had everything to gain, Hughes had as much to lose. To Suffren, at the moment of first meeting, belonged superiority of numbers and the power of taking the offensive, with all its advantages in choice of initiative. Upon Hughes fell the anxiety of the defensive, with inferior numbers, many assailable points, and uncertainty as to the place where the blow would fall. It was still true, though not so absolutely as 30 years before, that control in India depended upon control of the sea. The passing years had greatly strengthened the grip of England, and proportionately loosened that of France. Relatively, therefore, the need of Suffren to destroy his enemy was greater than that of his predecessors, D'Aché and others, whereas Hughes could count upon a greater strength in the English possessions, and so bore a somewhat less responsibility than the admirals who went before him. Nevertheless, the sea was still by far the most important factor in the coming strife, and for its proper control it was necessary to disable more or less completely the enemy's fleet, and to have some reasonably secure base. For the latter purpose Trincomalee, though unhealthy, was by far the best harbor on the east coast, but it had not been long enough in the hands of English to be well supplied. Hughes therefore inevitably fell back on Madras for repairs after an action, and was forced to leave Trincomalee to its own resources until ready to take the sea again. Suffren, on the other hand, found all ports alike destitute of naval supplies, while the natural advantages of Trincomalee made its possession an evident object of importance to him, and Hughes so understood it. Independently, therefore, of the tradition of the English navy impelling Hughes to attack, the influence of which appears plainly between the lines of his letters, Suffren had in moving toward Trincomalee a threat which was bound to draw his adversary out of his port. Nor did Trincomalee stand alone. The existing war between Hyder Ali and the English made it imperative for Suffren to seize a port upon the mainland at which to land the 3,000 troops carried by the squadron to cooperate on shore against the common enemy, and from which supplies at least of food might be had. Everything, therefore, concurred to draw Hughes out and make him seek to cripple or hinder the French fleet. The method of his action would depend upon his own and his adversary's skill, and upon the uncertain element of the weather. It was plainly desirable for him not to be brought to battle except on his own terms, in other words, without some advantage of situation to make up for his weaker force. As a fleet upon the open sea cannot secure any advantages of ground, the position favoring the weaker was that to windward, giving choice of time and some choice as to method of attack, the offensive position used defensively, with the intention to make an offensive movement if circumstances warrant. The leeward position left the weaker no choice but to run, or to accept action on its adversary's terms. Whatever may be thought of Hughes's skill, it must be conceded that his task was difficult. Still, it can be clearly thought down to two requisites. The first was to get in a blow at the French fleet, so as to reduce the present inequality; the second, to keep Suffren from getting Trincomalee, which depended wholly on the fleet. Suffren, on the other hand, if he could do Hughes in an action more injury than he himself received, would be free to turn in any direction he chose. Suffren, having sighted Hughes's fleet at Madras, February 15, anchored his own 4 miles to the northward. Considering the enemy's line, supported by the batteries, to be too strong for attack, he again got under way at 4 P.M. and stood south. Hughes also weighed, standing to the southward all that night under easy sail, and at daylight found that the enemy's squadron had separated from the convoy, the ships of war being about 12 miles east, while the transports were 9 miles southwest from him. This dispersal is said to have been due to the carelessness of the French frigates, which did not keep touch of the English. Hughes at once profited by it, chasing the convoy, knowing that the line of battle ships must follow. His copper-bottomed ships came up with and captured 6 of the enemy, 5 of which were English prizes. The 6th carried 300 troops with military stores. Hughes had scored a point. Suffren, of course, followed in a general chase, and by 3 P.M. 4 of his best sailors were 2 or 3 miles from the sternmost English ships. Hughes's ships were now much scattered, but not injudiciously so, for they joined by signal at 7 P.M. Both squadrons stood to the southeast during the night under easy sail. At daylight of the 17th, the date of the first of 4 actions fought between these two chiefs within 7 months, the fleets were 6 or 8 miles apart, the French bearing north-northeast from the English. The latter formed line ahead on the port tack with difficulty, owing to the light winds and frequent calms. Admiral Hughes explains that he hoped to weather the enemy by this course, so as to engage closely, counting probably on finding himself to windward when the sea breeze made. The wind continuing light, but with frequent squalls from north-northeast, the French, running before it, kept the puffs longer and neared the English rapidly, Suffren's intention to attack the rear being aided by Hughes's course. The latter, finding his rear straggling, bore up to line abreast, retreating to gain time for the ships to close on the centre. These movements in line abreast continued till 20 minutes before 4 P.M., when, finding he could not escape attack on the enemy's terms, Hughes hauled his wind on the port tack and awaited it. Whether by his own fault or not, he was now in the worst possible position, waiting for an attack by a superior force at its pleasure. The rear ship of his line, the Exeter, was not closed up, and there appears no reason why she should not have been made the van by forming on the starboard tack, and thus bringing the other ships up to her. The method of Suffren's attack is differently stated by him and by Hughes, but the difference is in detail only. The main facts are certain. Hughes says the enemy steered down on the rear of our line in an irregular double line abreast, in which formation they continued till the moment of collision, when 3 of the enemy's ships in the first line bore right down upon the Exeter, while 4 more of their second line, headed by the Héros, in which M. de Suffren had his flag, hauled along the outside of the first line toward our centre. At 5 minutes past 4, the enemy's 3 ships began their fire upon the Exeter, which was returned by her and her second ahead. The action became general from our rear to our centre, the commanding ship of the enemy, with 3 others of their second line, leading down on our centre, yet never advancing farther than opposite to the Superbe, our centre ship, with little or no wind and some heavy rain during the engagement. Under these circumstances, the enemy brought 8 of their best ships to the attack of 5 of ours, as the van of our line, consisting of the Monmouth, Eagle, Burford, and Worcester, could not be brought into action without tacking on the enemy, for which there was not enough wind. Here we will leave them, and give Suffren's account of how he took up his position. In his report to the Minister of Marine he says: "I should have destroyed the English squadron less by superior numbers than by the advantageous disposition in which I attacked it. I attacked the rear ship and stood along the English line as far as the 6th. I thus made 3 of them useless, so that we were 12 against 6. I began the fight at 3:30 in the afternoon, taking the lead and making signal to form line as best could be done. Without that I would not have engaged. At 4 I made signal to 3 ships to double on the enemy's rear, and to the squadron to approach within pistol shot. This signal, though repeated, was not executed. I did not myself give the example, in order that I might hold in check the 3 van ships, which by tacking would have doubled on me. However, except the Brilliant, which doubled on the rear, no ship was as close as mine, nor received as many shots." The principal point of difference in the two accounts is that Suffren asserts that his flag-ship passed along the whole English line, from the rear to the 6th ship, while Hughes says the French divided into 2 lines, which, upon coming near, steered, one on the rear, the other on the centre of his squadron. The latter would be the better manoeuvre, for if the leading ship of the attack passed, as Suffren asserts, along the enemy's line from the rear to the 6th, she should receive in succession the first fire of 6 ships, which ought to cripple her and confuse her line. Suffren also notes the intention to double on the rear by placing 3 ships to leeward of it. 2 of the French did take this position. Suffren further gives his reason for not closing with his own ship which led, but as those which followed him went no nearer, Hughes's attention was not drawn to his action. The French commodore was seriously, and it would seem justly, angered by the inaction of several of his captains. Of the second in command he complained to the minister: "Being at the head, I could not well see what was going on in the rear. I had directed M. de Tromelin to make signals to ships which might be near him. He only repeated my own without having them carried out." This complaint was wholly justified. On the 6th of February, 10 days before the fight, he had written to his second as follows: "If we are so fortunate as to be to windward, as the English are not more than 8, or at most 9, my intention is to double on their rear. Supposing your division to be in the rear, you will see by your position what number of ships will overlap the enemy's line, and you will make signal to them to double, that is, to engage on the lee side. In any case, I beg you to order to your division the manoeuvres which you shall think best fitted to assure the success of the action. The capture of Trincomalee and that of Negapatam, and perhaps of all Ceylon, would make us wish for a general action." The last 2 sentences reveal Suffren's own appreciation of the military situation in the Indian seas, which demanded, first, the disabling of the hostile fleet, next, the capture of certain strategic ports. That this diagnosis was correct is as certain as that it reversed the common French maxims, which would have put the port first and the fleet second as objectives. A general action was the first desideratum of Suffren, and it is therefore safe to say that to avoid such action should have been the first object of Hughes. The attempt of the latter to gain the windward position was consequently correct, and as in the month of February the sea breeze at Madras sets in from the eastward and southward about 11 A.M., he probably did well to steer in that general direction, though the result disappointed him. De Guichen, in one of his engagements with Rodney, shaped the course of his fleet with reference to being to windward when the afternoon breeze made, and was successful. What use Hughes would have made of the advantage of the wind can only be inferred from his own words, that he sought it in order to engage more closely. There is not in this the certain promise of any skilful use of a tactical advantage. Suffren also illustrates, in his words to Tromelin, his conception of the duties of a second in command, which may fairly be paralleled with that of Nelson in his celebrated order before Trafalgar. In this first action he led the main attack himself, leaving the direction of what may be called the reserve, at any rate of the second half of the assault, to his lieutenant, who, unluckily for him, was not a Collingwood, and utterly failed to support him. It is probable that Suffren's leading was due not to any particular theory, but to the fact that his ship was the best sailer in the fleet, and that the lateness of the hour and lightness of the wind made it necessary to bring the enemy to action speedily. But here appears a fault on the part of Suffren. Leading as he did involves, not necessarily but very naturally, the idea of example, and holding his own ship outside of close range for excellent tactical reasons led the captains in his wake naturally, almost excusably, to keep at the same distance, notwithstanding his signals. The conflict between orders and example, which cropped out so singularly at Vicksburg in our Civil War, causing the misunderstanding and estrangement of two gallant officers, should not be permitted to occur. It is the business of a chief to provide against such misapprehensions by most careful previous explanation of both the letter and spirit of his plans. Especially is this so at sea, where smoke, slack wind, and intervening rigging make signals hard to read, though they are almost the only means of communication. This was Nelson's practice, nor was Suffren a stranger to the idea. Dispositions well concerted with those who are to carry them out are needed, he wrote to D'Estaing 3 years before. The excuse which may be pleaded for those who followed him and engaged cannot avail for the rear ships, and especially not for the second in command, who knew Suffren's plans. He should have compelled the rear ships to take position to leeward, leading himself if necessary. There was wind enough, for two captains actually engaged to leeward, one of them without orders, acting through the impulse of his own good will and courage, on Nelson saying, "No captain can do very wrong who places his ship alongside that of an enemy." He received the special commendation of Suffren, in itself an honor and a reward. Whether the failure of so many of his fellows was due to inefficiency or to a spirit of faction and disloyalty is unimportant to the general military writer, however interesting to French officers jealous for the honor of their service. Suffren's complaints, after several disappointments, became vehement. "My heart," wrote he, "is wrung by the most general defection. I have just lost the opportunity of destroying the English squadron. All, yes, all might have got near, since we were to windward and ahead, and none did so. Several among them had behaved bravely in other combats. I can only attribute this horror to the wish to bring the cruise to an end, to ill will, and to ignorance, for I dare not suspect anything worse. The result has been terrible. I must tell you, Monseigneur, that officers who have been long at the Isle of France are neither seamen nor military men. Not seamen, for they have not been at sea, and the trading temper, independent and insubordinate, is absolutely opposed to the military spirit." This letter, written after his fourth battle with Hughes, must be taken with allowance. Not only does it appear that Suffren himself, hurried away on this last occasion by his eagerness, was partly responsible for the disorder of his fleet, but there were other circumstances, and above all the character of some of the officers blamed, which made the charge of a general disaffection excessive. On the other hand, it remains true that after 4 general actions with superior numbers on the part of the French, under a chief of the skill and art of Suffren, the English squadron, to use his own plaintive expression, still existed. Not only so, but had not lost a single ship. The only conclusion that can be drawn is that of a French naval writer: quantity disappeared before quality. It is immaterial whether the defect was due to inefficiency or disaffection. The inefficiency which showed itself on the field of battle disappeared in the general conduct of the campaign, where the qualities of the chief alone told. The battle of February 17th ended with a shift of wind to the southeast at 6 P.M. after 2 hours' action. The English were thus brought to windward, and their van ships enabled to share in the fight. Night falling, Suffren at 6:30 hauled his squadron by the wind on the starboard tack, heading northeast, while Hughes steered south under easy sail. It is said by Captain Chevalier of the French navy that Suffren intended to renew the fight next day. In that case he should have taken measures to keep within reach. It was too plainly Hughes's policy not to fight without some advantage, to allow the supposition that with one ship, the Exeter, lost to him through the concentration of so many enemies upon her, he would quietly await an attack. This is so plain as to make it probable that Suffren saw sufficient reason in the results to his fleet and the misconduct of his officers not to wish to renew action at once. The next morning the two fleets were out of sight of each other. The continuance of the north wind and the crippled state of two of his ships forced Hughes to go to Trincomalee, where the sheltered harbor allowed them to repair. Suffren, anxious about his transports, went to Pondicherry, where he anchored in their company. It was his wish then to proceed against Negapatam, but the commander of the troops chose to act against Cuddalore. After negotiations and arrangements with Hyder Ali, the army landed south of Porto Novo and marched against Cuddalore, which surrendered on the 4th of April. Meanwhile, Suffren, anxious to act against his principal objective, had sailed again on the 23rd of March. It was his hope to cut off two ships of the line which were expected from England. For this he was too late. The two 74s joined the main body at Madras, March 30th. Hughes had refitted at Trincomalee in a fortnight and reached Madras again on the 12th of March. Soon after the reinforcement had joined him, he sailed again for Trincomalee with troops and military stores for the garrison. On the 8th of April, Suffren's squadron was seen to the northeast, also standing to the southward. Hughes kept on through that and the two following days with light northerly winds. On the 11th he made the coast of Ceylon, 50 miles north of Trincomalee, and bore away for the port. On the morning of the 12th, the French squadron in the northeast was seen crowding sail in pursuit. It was the day on which Rodney and De Grasse met in the West Indies, but the parts were reversed. Here the French, not the English, sought action. The speed of the ships in both squadrons was very unequal. Each had some coppered ships and some not coppered. Hughes found that his slow sailors could not escape the fastest of his enemy, a condition which will always compel a retreating force to hazard an action unless it can resolve to give up the rear ships, and which makes it imperative for the safety as well as the efficiency of a squadron that vessels of the same class should all have a certain minimum speed. The same cause, the danger of a separated ship, led the unwilling De Grasse the same day in another scene to a risky manoeuvre and a great mishap. Hughes, with better reason, resolved to fight, and at 9 A.M. formed his line on the starboard tack, standing inshore, the squadron in good order, with intervals of 2 cables between the ships. His account, which again varies from that of Suffren, giving a radically different idea of the tactics used by the French commodore, and more to the credit of the latter's skill, will first be followed. He says: "The enemy, bearing north by east, distant 6 miles, with wind at north by east, continued manoeuvring their ships and changing their positions in line, till 15 minutes past noon, when they bore away to engage us, 5 sail of their van stretching along to engage the ships of our van, and the other 7 sail steering directly on our 3 centre ships, the Superbe, the Monmouth, her second ahead, and the Monarcha, her second astern. At 1:30 the engagement began in the van of both squadrons. 3 minutes after, I made the signal for battle. The French admiral in the Héros and his second astern in l'Orient, both 74s, bore down on the Superbe within pistol shot. The Héros continued in her position, giving and receiving a severe fire for 9 minutes, and then stood on, greatly damaged, to attack the Monmouth, at that time engaged with another of the enemy's ship, making room for the ships in his rear to come up to the attack of our centre, where the engagement was hottest. At 3 the Monmouth had her mizzenmast shot away, and in a few minutes her mainmast, and bore out of the line to leeward, and at 40 minutes past 3, the wind unexpectedly continuing far northerly without any sea breeze, and being careful not to entangle our ships with the land, I made signal to wear and haul by the wind in a line of battle on the larboard tack, still engaging the enemy." Now here practically was concentration with a vengeance. In this, the hardest fight between these two hard fighters, the English loss was 137 killed and 430 wounded in 11 ships. Of this total, the 2 centre ships, the flagship and her next ahead, lost 104 killed and 198 wounded, 53% of the entire loss of the squadron, of which they formed 18%. The casualties were very much heavier, in proportion to the size of the ships, than those of the leaders of the 2 columns at Trafalgar. The material injury to hulls, spars, etc., was yet more serious. The English squadron, by this concentration of the enemy upon a small fraction of it, was entirely crippled. Inferior when the action began, its inferiority was yet more decisive by the subtraction of two ships, and Suffren's freedom to move was increased. But how far was this concentration intended by Suffren? For this we must go to the pages of two French writers, who base their narratives upon his own despatches on record in the French Marine Office. The practical advantage gained by the French must also be tested by comparing the lists of casualties and the injuries received by their individual ships, for it is evident that if both the squadrons received the same total amount of injury, but that with the English it fell on two ships, so that they could not be ready for action for a month or more, while with the French the damage was divided among the 12, allowing them to be ready again in a few days, the victory tactically and strategically would rest with the latter. As regards Suffren's purpose, there is nothing to indicate that he meant to make such an attack as Hughes describes. Having 12 ships to the English 11, his intention seems to have been to pursue the usual English practice: form line parallel to the enemy, bear down together, and engage ship to ship. To this he added one simple combination. The 12th French ship, being unprovided with an opponent, was to engage the rear English ship on her lee side, placing her thus between two fires. In truth, a concentration upon the van and centre, such as Hughes describes, is tactically inferior to a like effort upon the centre and rear of a column. This is true of steamers even, which, though less liable to loss of motive power, must still turn round to get from van to rear, losing many valuable seconds. But it is specially true of sailing vessels, and above all in the light, baffling airs which are apt to mark the change of monsoon at the season when this fight was fought. Nelson emphasized his contempt of the Russians of his day by saying he would not hesitate to attack their van, counting upon throwing the whole line in confusion from their want of seamanship. But though entertaining a not much better opinion of the Spaniards, he threw the weight of attack on the rear of the allied fleets at Trafalgar. In dealing with such seamen as the captains of Hughes's fleet, it would have been an error to assail the van instead of the rear. Only a dead calm could have kept the latter out of action. Suffren's attack is thus described by Captain Chevalier. After mentioning Hughes's forming line on the starboard tack, he says, "This manoeuvre was imitated by the French, and the two squadrons ran on parallel lines, heading about west-northwest. At 11, our line being well formed, Suffren made signal to keep away to west-southwest by a movement all together. Our ships did not keep their bearing upon the prescribed line, and the van, composed of the best sailors, came first within range of the enemy. At 1, the leading ships of the English fleet opened fire upon the Vengeur and Artésien French van. These two ships, having luffed to return the fire, were at once ordered to keep away again. Suffren, who wished for a decisive action, kept his course, receiving without reply the shots directed upon his ship by the enemy. When at pistol range of the Superbe, he hauled to the wind, and the signal to open fire appeared at his main-mast head. Admiral Hughes, having only 11 ships, the Bizarre, according to the dispositions taken by the commander-in-chief, was to attack on the quarter the rear ship of the English fleet and double on it to leeward. At the moment when the first cannon shots were heard, our worst sailors were not up with their stations, breathing the letter and not the spirit of the Commodore's orders. The captains of these ships luffed at the same time as those which preceded them. Hence it resulted that the French line formed a curve, whose extremities were represented in the van by the Artésien and Vengeur, and in the rear by the Bizarre, Ajax, and Sévère. In consequence, these ships were very far from those which corresponded to them in the enemy's line. It is evident from all this, written by a warm admirer of Suffren, who has had full access to the official papers, that the French chief intended an attack elementary in conception and difficult of execution. To keep a fleet on a line of bearing, sailing free, requires much drill, especially when the ships have different rates of speed, as had Suffren's. The extreme injury suffered by the Superbe and Monmouth, undeniably due to a concentration, cannot be attributed to Suffren's dispositions. The injuries which the Hérault received at the beginning of the action did not allow her to remain by the Superbe. Not being able to back her topsails in time, the braces having been cut, she passed ahead and was only stopped on the beam of the Monmouth. This accounts for the suffering of the latter ship, already injured, and now contending with a much larger opponent. The Superbe was freed from Suffren only to be engaged by the next Frenchman, an equally heavy ship, and when the Monmouth drifted or bore up to leeward, the French flagship also drifted, so that for a few moments she fired her stern guns into the Superbe's bow. The latter at the same time was engaged on the beam and quarter by two French ships, who, either with or without signal, came up to shield their commodore. An examination of the list of casualties shows that the loss of the French was much more distributed among their ships than was the case with the English. No less than 3 of the latter escaped without a man killed, while the French only 1. The kernel of the action seems to have been in the somewhat fortuitous concentration of 2 French 74s and 1 64 on an English 74 and 64. Assuming the ships to have been actually of the same force as their rates, the French brought, counting broadside only, 106 guns against 69. Some unfavorable criticism was excited by the management of Admiral Hughes during the 3 days preceding the fight, because he refrained from attacking the French, although they were for much of the time to leeward, with only 1 ship more than the English, and much separated at that. It was thought that he had the opportunity of beating them in detail. The accounts accessible are too meagre to permit an accurate judgment upon this opinion, which probably reflected the mess table and quarter-deck talk of the subordinate officers of the fleet. Hughes's own report of the position of the 2 fleets is vague, and in one important particular directly contradictory to the French. If the alleged opportunity offered, the English admiral, in declining to use it, adhered to the resolve with which he sailed, neither to seek nor shun the enemy, but to go directly to Trincomalee and land the troops and supplies he had on board. In other words, he was governed in his action by the French rather than the English naval policy of subordinating the attack of the enemy's fleet to the particular mission in hand. If for this reason he did not allow a favorable chance of fighting to slip, he certainly had reason bitterly to regret his neglect in the results of the battle which followed. But in the lack of precise information, the most interesting point to be noted is the impression made upon public and professional opinion, indicating how strongly the English held that the attack of the enemy's fleet was the first duty of an English admiral. It may also be said that he could hardly have fared worse by attacking than he did by allowing the enemy to become the assailant, and certainly not worse than he would have fared had Suffren's captains been as good as his own. After the action, towards sunset, both squadrons anchored in 15 fathoms of water, irregular soundings, 3 of the French ships taking the bottom on coral patches. Here they lay for a week, 2 miles apart, refitting. Hughes, from the ruined condition of the Monmouth, expected an attack; but when Suffren had finished his repairs on the 19th, he got under way and remained outside for 24 hours, inviting a battle which he would not begin. He realized the condition of the enemy so keenly as to feel the necessity of justifying his action to the Minister of Marine, which he did for 8 reasons unnecessary to particularize here. The last was the lack of efficiency and hearty support on the part of the captains. It is not likely that Suffren erred on the side of excessive caution. On the contrary, his most marked defect as a commander-in-chief was an ardor which, when in sight of the enemy, became impatience, and carried him at times into action hastily and in disorder. But if in the details and execution of his battles, in his tactical combinations, Suffren was at times foiled by his own impetuosity and the shortcomings of most of his captains, in the general conduct of the campaign, in strategy, where the personal qualities of the commander-in-chief mainly told, his superiority was manifest, and achieved brilliant success. Then ardor showed itself in energy, untiring and infectious. The eagerness of his hot Provençal blood overrode difficulty, created resources out of destitution, and made itself felt through every vessel under his orders. No military lesson is more instructive nor of more enduring value than the rapidity and ingenuity with which he, without a port of supplies, continually refitted his fleet and took the field, while his slower enemy was dawdling over his repairs. End of Chapter 12, Part 1.